So the funny thing is, a lot of what I focus on actually has very little to do with coding.
Okay.
And that's because coding is really only about 10% coding and like 90% detective work.
Okay.
It's the most of what you do as a software engineer is reading code.
Okay.
So whether that's you have to debug something, or you have to troubleshoot, even if you were building it and you run it and it doesn't give you the result you want, there's an error or the test fails or whatever, then the first thing you have to do is you have to dive in and figure out what's going on. It's the biggest mistake I see new developers do time and time again, which is they try something, it fails, they get an error message, and then instead of reading the error message and trying to figure out, they just go back into their code and try something else. And before you know it, they're hopelessly lost because they actually don't know what problem they're trying to solve. The first thing I try to instill in new developers is really curiosity. Is take a moment, it didn't work. Why didn't it work? It's almost like that thing that they teach, managers and executives, the 5 whys, right? Like this, this failed. Why? Well, this team didn't deliver when they were supposed to. Why? Well, they had a lot of leave that they didn't account for. Why? Right? By the time you get to the 5th why, you're like, okay, there's actually this process problem that we can fix.
Interesting.
And you can do the same thing with software development. So, whatever attempt to access a property of undefined. Why? Why was this undefined? Well, where did the value come from? Okay, well, it's a parameter for this function. Okay, well, where did it get called from? Well, it got called from over here. Okay, well, what's that variable? Where does it get its value? Oh, that's supposed to come from the request body, from a post request. Oh, hey, well, that's weird. In the form, the input has the wrong name. It's supposed to be whatever. It's supposed to be favorite sport, but we accidentally named it favorite spork. And honestly, that really is software development in a nutshell. I did a project a little while ago. Goodness, now we're 7 or 8 months ago. I'm getting out of practice. Anyway, did a software project. It was just a little thing. I was building this thing for the client had a huge code base written in Python 2, and they needed to one dependency that only ran in Python 3. So there's this library they wanted to run, but it only worked in Python 3. And yes, I know Python 2 has been dead for some time, but this is like hundreds of thousands of lines of code. They're not about to do a full rewrite or Python 2 to 3. Anyway, point is, rewriting their code for Python 3, not an option. And so I built this little daemon that ran locally, and it would connect over Unix socket, whatever. The interesting bit is there was a library I decided to use. It's called Twisted. And it's just it's really designed to build these kind of asynchronous input-output type systems. And the thing about it was, it kind of kicked my butt years and years ago when I first tried to use it. So at a job a long time ago, I tried to use it, couldn't get very far with it, and looked, in my defense, Twisted's documentation, it kind of assumes a lot of pre-existing knowledge. I'll be honest, when I finally did manage to figure it out, I just barely got it. But sure enough, just even today, I've been doing this for close to 20 years, and I still do the same things that a new developer would have to do. Okay, how do I do this? All right, so I got to look through the documentation, get a feel for how this thing is actually meant to be run. Occasionally things don't work. I get error messages, so I've got to dive into the stack trace, figure out exactly what's going on. And sometimes that also means diving into code that I didn't write, and trying to understand, build my mental model of how does the Twisted framework, not the whole thing, but these pieces of the Twisted framework, how does it actually work? And it did take a lot of effort, but by the end of it, well, number one, I managed to get it working. That's always happy. But 2, now I understand how to use Twisted to solve certain types of problems, right? And so then the next time I want to build something like this, I can just reach for Twisted and just pop it right in. Take a bit of, I have to remember, how did I do that? So it's not gonna be perfect. But I've essentially now just gained a little extra momentum. And that's why I liken this to a freight train, is in the moment you feel like, oh my God, I've got to solve this problem. I've got this, I've got this task that's been assigned to me. I have to fix it. Or even just, my portfolio, I was trying to build this app and I wanted to add this feature and it's not working, and I just want to get it working. But taking that extra little bit of time just to kind of stop, pause, figure out what's actually happening, maybe even read some code that you didn't write yourself that came from a third-party library, even from React or some really big, complicated Apollo, it's one of these existing frameworks that's really big and feels intimidating. And then you realize, oh, actually it's just JavaScript code or whatever. But it's like a freight train. So it does take some time to get up to speed. but once you get moving, you're unstoppable. Another thing is to sort of cultivate curiosity. Not so much, the thing about curiosity is it can be a distraction. So you're trying to solve a problem, you're researching something, some result comes up in the search engine, you're like, okay, that's not related to my problem, but it looks interesting. And I think a mistake that a lot of developers of all skill levels make is they say, oh well, and they move on. And the solution is not to open up that link and then get derailed from what you're doing, but some way, however you do it, if you just kind of suspend that tab and then you come back to it later, or there's a bunch of apps like Pocket or Instapaper where you can send it to some queue somewhere and then you can read through it later when you have the headspace and when you have the time, because that's where a lot of these, like when you're focused on solving specific problems, that's a very narrow focus. And there's a lot of other things that you need to be aware of, right? Because our digital tech evolves constantly.
Yeah. And
so, it's an age-old question you sometimes get in interviews is, what are you doing to keep up with the pace of innovation? And this is one of the ways that I use to keep up with the pace of innovation. I do it myself. I've got about 1,000 articles. It takes me about once something gets added to my list, it kind of takes a year or so before it gets to the top. But sure enough. But that's just a great way just to keep in touch with things. And look, that sometimes it's not new tech. It's just, oh, I didn't know you could do that in React. Did you know that React has error boundaries? Totally forgot about that. When you get a JavaScript error in React, it doesn't have to crash your whole application. You can actually limit it to just a couple of components. Like, oh, didn't know you could do that. And sure enough, next day, practically something comes up and like, oh, we could use error boundaries to solve that. It happens all the time.